we're going to talk about the Sabbath.
Sure.
Obviously, this is one of the primary criticisms that myself or Christians will get by this group. If you run into these guys, the World Mission Society Church of God members, what they're going to do is almost immediately begin to tell you about how Christians have changed the Sabbath.
Sure.
Change it to Sunday.
Which is always interesting. They have a hard time, because I've had a few people come up to me with that tactic, and they don't know what to do, because they say, do you rest on the Sabbath? And I say, yeah.
Yeah.
And then they're like, wait, what? Are you a Christian? Yes.
Right.
What? You're not supposed to do that.
Right.
I'm like, why not?
Yeah.
And then they don't know where to go from there.
Yeah, it's the assumptions, right? Like
Right.
they know what you believe and how you practice your
because
faith.
they've tailored their tactic to critique and criticize a specific stream of Christianity, and the church is quite broad and diverse. You look at on a global scale.
There's Christians that keep all the feasts.
Absolutely.
But the interesting thing is their attacks, like you just said, they tailor those criticisms toward that certain group of Christians.
Right.
And their criticisms only work if you answer
the right way.
If you answer the right way. So when you answer the wrong way, it's like, oh well, I don't have a play in my playbook for this.
Yes.
So can you explain that? Like when you say yes to that question, or when you say you do keep the Sabbath,
yes.
What do you mean?
What I mean is I have a day every week that I set aside. I'm pretty busy. I know you're really busy. A lot of us who live in the West especially have very full lives, maybe too full, I think, if we're honest. And a few years ago, I felt encouraged by the Lord that I was making myself too busy, even doing things for Him, and that I should, practice Sabbath, that I should set aside a day every week where I'm going to be very intentional about not filling up that day, but instead setting aside that day to many things. Meet with the Lord, just be in His presence, actually like rest, not just physically rest, but like emotional rest. Like I'm not going to think about what I need to do in the coming week. I'm not going to think too hard about what kind of a week I've just had, whether it was good or bad, but I'm just going to enjoy this day with Him and really notice, be mindful of the good things that He's put in my life. And I can have some really bad weeks, but until I take that time to just cease from all my activity and actually intentionally notice, wow, I have an amazing wife. I have such awesome children. I am so blessed that, somehow miraculously there's always food on the table in our home. There's so many good things in my life that I could spend, day after day after day, not noticing, not enjoying, not being thankful for. And those are all gifts from my Father in heaven. And relationship with Him is the ultimate gift. And you have to make space for a relationship. You're married. You know that. The first thing you learn when you get married is oh wow, I can't just, do what I was doing before, but now I have this sweet wife at home, waiting for me. No, you have to invest in the relationship. You have to make time, make space to be together and be vulnerable with one another and allow that relationship to be nurtured and grow. And it's the same way with our relationship with the Lord. If we're not being intentional about making time for that, it's not going to grow. And not because He doesn't want it to, because we're not making ourselves available for it.
So you use the word cease, and probably you use that intentionally.
Maybe. That might be in the Bible.
Yeah. So cease or stop. And then also you mentioned making room.
Yes.
And so I think when I think about that, it makes me think about Jesus saying, man was not made for Sabbath, but Sabbath was made for man.
Yes.
And how Sabbath is actually this gift that enables us to make room not just in our physical hourly schedule, but inwardly. Sabbath, I think, is meant to and should remind us to make room for God having his rightful position in our hearts and in our minds.
Yes.
And so you use that word cease or stop, which is what the word Sabbath, you'd know more about this than I do, but in Hebrew is Shabbat, right? Which that word simply means, or maybe a simple way of describing what that meaning is to cease, to stop. Would that be correct?
It actually comes from the Hebrew word 7.
7?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, now we're getting really deep.
I know. Yeah. And so the word, the etymology that you're referring to actually comes from, like, the name of the day doesn't come from ceasing. The idea of ceasing comes from having similarity with the day. It's like you're doing the day, what the day is called.
Really?
Yes.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
See, that's why you're here, so I can learn things.
Yeah. And I only know most of this stuff because Arabic and Hebrew, so I grew up speaking Arabic. Arabic and Hebrew are so similar. And so in Arabic, all of our days of the week are just the numbers. So we don't, this isn't shocking to anybody, but like the days of the week that we use in English are all pagan, right? Monday is the moon day for the moon god. Sunday is the sun day for the sun god, right? And all the other days are the days of, depending on what part of Europe you're in, either it's Zeus or it's, Odin, Wednesday is Odin's day, Thor's day, right? And not the Marvel universe like the pagan god Thor, right? That's where all that comes from. But in Arabic, we call it day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, all the way to day 7.
Really?
And
you
Hebrew,
just have numbers.
We just have the numbers. And so the seventh day is day 7. Yeah. We call it the 7th.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah, so you say, what are you doing on the 7th day?
Yeah. So it's interesting, like that's honestly with World Mission Society Church of God, you acknowledging that the days of the week in the West are named after pagan gods. They're going to jump all over that. But yeah, I mean, it's historical.
Right.
Stuff.
They were already that way. Christians didn't do that. They just
Christians
went with the flow. They were in a pagan culture, and the pagans had already named everything.
Right.
And
we're not worshiping the Sunday or the sun god on Sunday.
Correct. We shouldn't be
any more than we're worshiping the gods that are represented by the other days.
Correct.
So maybe though, in layman's terms, you're saying that Sabbath comes from, or how would you word that, from seventh day? That is its ultimate meaning.
Yes.
So, but within the word Sabbath or Shabbat or whatever word you want to use, it does entail this idea of that word you used earlier of ceasing, right?
Right.
Of stopping.
Right.
So maybe talk about that a little bit, and what is the meaning that you feel is behind that, like getting into what ultimately the Sabbath means. What is the Sabbath about?
Yes.
What is the Sabbath intended to do for us in relation with
and in us.
God and in us? Right.
Yeah. Sure. So a great technique whenever you want to study anything, and when we're talking about what is the Sabbath, what are these things, like the only source that I'm going to use is the Bible, because we're talking about not what does the Sabbath mean, what did it mean to me when I was a Muslim, or what does it mean to Hindus, or what does it mean to atheists, because it can mean nothing, it can mean something different, whatever. We're talking about how does the Bible introduce us to the concept of Sabbath, and what does the Bible have to say about that day, what makes it unique, what does it have to say about what we should or shouldn't do on that day, those types of things. And whenever you want to study something like that, the best way I found, and I've been studying Scripture for now 25 years, and so I've learned a lot of ways not to study the Bible, like ways that aren't helpful, and I've learned some things that are helpful. And one of the best ways is find the first appearance of that word, whatever you're studying, whether it's faith, whether it's salvation, whether it's repentance, redemption, any big theological meaty word, find the first time that's used in a sentence in the Bible, and pay attention to the story that you find that word in. And often that story will help create, like it'll paint the painting for you. It will set the canvas just right for you to understand, oh, that's what that's really about. And then if you take that original image and then begin to look, okay, as that word shows up again and again through Scripture, do you notice how every time it's almost like it's pointing back to that original?
It's linking to it.
It's linking back to it
Yeah.
over and over and over and over and over again. So that, for a word like salvation, the first time it shows up is at the parting of the Red Sea. And then from that point on, which is really interesting.
That is interesting.
It's all the way, about a third of the way into Exodus.
Right.
So we went through the whole book of Genesis and the word salvation never came up.
And you see specifically moments where Abraham is saved.
Right. But the author intentionally, the author is saving that word.
Yeah.
Because they want, I'm just convinced this is an intentional part on the part of the biblical authors. They introduce a new word into our vocabulary at the perfect moment that really captures and defines fully what that word means. And the parting of the Red Sea is the big moment. Like no other scene that's happened before then could fully capture what to be saved by Yahweh means.
So then where does Sabbath first show up?
Like strikingly enough on the very first page of the Bible. It opens with Sabbath. And the creation story of Genesis chapter 1 and a little bit into 2 is setting the stage for us about why we're here, what is here, what is this place, how did all this stuff around us end up here? Does it have purpose? Does it have meaning? All the types of questions that humans have been asking for thousands and thousands of years. So this is the Bible, answering an oft asked question that all the other religions, by the way, in the ancient Near East were trying to answer that same question. The Egyptians had their own version, like of a Genesis 1 story. The Babylonians, Sumerians, Akkadians, they had their own versions. The Canaanites had their own idea about these things. But what the author of Genesis is doing is saying this, I know you've heard a story. Let me set the record straight. This is like the actual story of why all this is here and who did this. How did we end up here? Humans and this planet and all of that. And it's a story that's ordered around 7 days. Not 6 days, not 8 days, not 10 days. That would be nice and round for metric system living people. But no, it's like 7 days. And I don't know how familiar you are or your viewers are with chiasms.
Not very. But it's something we need to...
It's something we got to dive into. So the authors of the Bible love chiasms. They love them. And they use them as teaching tools throughout story after story after story. And so what all a chiasm is it's this idea where you order the narrative or the poem or whatever it is that you're saying. You can even do it you can even order an essay in this way, where the first point and the last point mirror one another. And then the second point and the second to last point mirror one another. And when I say mirror, I don't mean that they're verbatim the same thing. Sometimes they are in these stories, and then it's like really obvious what's happening. But more often than not, it's just there's a slight variation.
And there's a connection between.
Exactly. Yeah. There's some relationship. The author's saying there's some relationship between these two things. Sometimes it's immediately obvious. Other times you really need to sit and think about it.
So do you have an example of that like something that people would be familiar with that you could give as an example of a chiasm?
Oh my goodness, like almost every page of the Bible this stuff is going on. Let me think. I'm trying to think of a...
Is there one in Genesis that relates to the Sabbath?
Well, Genesis chapter 1 is a chiasm. Yeah. That's where I was going with this.
Okay.
So the 7 days are a chiasm.
Uh-huh.
And if you think about it, it means like there's a relationship between the first day and the last day. There's a relationship between the second day and the sixth day, right, and so on and so forth. So there's something really special about day 4. And, Jewish, Hebrew students of the Bible have noticed this, for thousands of years. Right. And what you always want to find is the center of the chiasm, because the center of the chiasm is sort of like the gives you either the key verse or the key phrase or even the key word that summarizes whatever the big idea of this whole thing was that you just read. So sometimes you read a story and you're like, what is the point of that? I don't understand. But then you realize it's a chiasm, and you find the center of the chiasm. It'll be some phrase or something like that. That'll be like, oh, that's the thing that's being highlighted, that this whole story exists, at least in part, to convey that message. That's really interesting. So here, I'll give you an example of a chiasm in the gospel. So I've been teaching through the Gospel of Matthew. And Matthew is a chiasm, and it's alternating between sections of narrative, like just story, it's moving the story forward with action and dialogue, and then sections of teaching, just like monologues by Jesus, where he's giving some message or sermon, or extended warnings or words of encouragement. And so it's alternating between these two things all the way through, so that the center of the whole Gospel of Matthew is Jesus' teachings on the parables. What are the parables about? So that's the big idea of all of Matthew's Gospel, is buried in the parables. So that's just something to think about.
I assume you're not going to spoil and give away what.
No, you got to dig it. You got to go dig for it, because that's the fun. Right. That's the fun of this.
Yeah. So what is it in Genesis? Like what is conveyed about Sabbath in Genesis? That if we look at that, what does that say about what Sabbath is and what Sabbath means for us?
Right. So the point of Sabbath in the Genesis story is the way that the writer of Genesis 1 and that creation narrative is framing the story around the purpose of all of this matter, all of this creation that God's making, that God was making for himself a temple. There's a lot of temple language. It's the idea of ordering and filling. Like there's just so much going on there. But the main idea to like an ancient hearer or reader of the text would be, what they would hear with the language that's being used is the world is like a temple. It's a play, and a temple in the ancient mind was a house for a god to take his rest in. It's a place where he would be sort of enthroned on the earth, and it's a place where heaven and earth overlap one another.
It's a place where man could meet God, could interact with him, could fellowship with him, which is what the temple that Israel set up. Obviously, it was about that.
It all points back to Eden.
This is the way that you can approach God, and you're saying that's what Eden was. That's what the garden was. It was this temple space where God intended to dwell.
It was like an organic temple. Yeah. It was a temple not built with human hands.
Right, and it was this place where God would walk in the cool of the day.
In intimacy.
So it conveys this idea. The idea of temple conveys, I think, for a lot of people, they'll hear, the Garden of Eden was a temple, and they'll think of like a fancy cathedral church or something.
Because that's what we've made that to be.
But the temple, what you're saying is more about the relational aspect.
It's the concept of temple. What does a temple symbolize? And all, even, going back to, things like the pyramids in Egypt, these most ancient structures, they're all shaped like, mountains, or, these towers, right? It's all about trying to create a meeting space, because mountains represented a kind of a meeting spot between the sky and the land, or the heavens and the earth. And that's what we say in English. But the literal language in Hebrew is the sky and the land. And the mountaintop is where those two places come together. And that seemed to ancient man like that's where the gods would live. If they live anywhere, they live there. And so if we want to meet with the gods, we go up into the mountains.
As high as we can.
Right. And so that's why the language that in Genesis 2 that describes this garden meeting place between God and man, it's described as being on a mountaintop. So Eden is on the top of a mountain. And it doesn't say that explicitly in Genesis, though the writer of Ezekiel will make it explicit. that we should get that. We should read that story and get, of course, it's on a mountain. And then we think about it, well, how in the world do 4 rivers run out of a place unless it's, water only, last time I checked, runs downhill.
Right.
So that would mean it'd have to be in a high place for all the rivers to descend from it and water all the land of the earth.
So it was, if the rivers were all the 4 rivers running downward, logic just says, okay, Eden was elevated.
It was elevated, and there was a spring of water and enough abundant, overflowing, living water that it would create 4 rivers that would water the whole land. And when you look at the 4 rivers in Genesis 2, like it's specifically watering the lands of all, like, the nations. What Israel would have thought of as like the nations and the enemy nations. It's watering Egypt. It's watering Babylon. It's watering Assyria.
Which is kind of what God wanted man to do in the first place, right?
Yeah, there's something there. There's so much there. It's so deep.
Yeah.
But yeah, and so God rests on the 7th day to say, and there's so much to this, and anybody who wants to like dig into this, can look into the Midrash, which is just the collected commentaries of Jewish thinkers for thousands of years, and just see how the Jews understood the point of that ceasing. But one perspective will be that Yahweh, their God, he knows not just how to create things, how to bring forth new life, new creation, all of that, but he also knows when to say enough. He also knows that, once you unleash something like that, like just letting it go and just replicate, it's pretty soon, like, at first it's really good, and then suddenly, like, life is choking itself out because there's too much. And so he knows exactly where the balance is. When is enough enough? When is this all this goodness needs to have a boundary. It needs to have borders. Because if it goes beyond that, what started as good isn't good anymore. And so there's something of that happening there. But then there's also very much when it says that God rested, we tend to, unfortunately, in English, we think rest, think, oh, God went and took a nap because he's tired.
Right.
And that's not the idea at all. God is king, and he's the creator God, and so he's king of the universe. Malach ha'olam in Hebrew. And so the idea of him resting, where do kings rest? They rest on their throne. This was the idea that God, set up this temple creation. And then once everything was just right and just what it needed to be and no more, no less, he then took his seat upon his throne. And now he gets to enjoy this place that he's made for himself.
Because it's low-hanging fruit.
Go ahead.
So God finishes this work of creation and creates this dwelling place where man will be with him.
Yes.
This temple idea. A perfect creation.
Yes.
In that, he obviously commissions man to go fill the earth, multiply, have dominion.
Take this good thing, and you get to fill the rest of the world with this.
So God does all this work. It says in Genesis 2, he finishes this work, and then he rests. And in that, you're saying it conveys this idea of a king, not who goes and takes a nap, but sits down on a throne, having established this and finished this work that is good.
Yes.
And so I think it's impossible not to connect that to Jesus Christ, who finished the work of redemption, who finished the work of salvation, said, "It is finished."
Yes.
And then a repeated thing over and over in the New Testament is that...
And when does he finish? When does he say it is finished? At the end of the 6th day?
The end of the 6th day, right. And he resurrects, and then the New Testament tells us he sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. So Christ finished his work, said in essence, it is good, what he had accomplished for mankind and their redemption, and then he is seated now at the right hand of the throne of God. So there's some connections there, maybe.
I think they're intentional.
Yeah.
So that's sort of our introduction, that whole story. And oh my goodness, like we could spend an hour just diving into all the juicy goodness that is in Genesis 1. But that's the foundation story of where we even get the idea of a 7th day that is significant. It's almost like a bonus day in a way, because you have this perfect like three cycles, like three days of ordering, 3 days of filling, and the two kind of connect and overlap one another. And then you think it'd be finished, but now we have this extra day that is all about now the enjoyment and the relationship now available to us because of what God has done in the 6 days. Now we have the 7th day to actually do something with it.
And enjoy it.
Yes.
Right. And so as Christ accomplished his good work on the cross, finished it, is now seated.
Yes.
What he's calling believers, what he's calling, well, the world to do is not to now run off and try to work and do something to accomplish what he has already accomplished. And, obviously if Adam and Eve had, been brought into creation and then started trying to tweak and twerk with God's creation, make it better, that wasn't what God wanted them to do. He wanted them to enjoy what he had freely finished for them. And so again, man, the Sabbath is in my mind increasingly, I'm just seeing how filled with the gospel it is. Like the Sabbath tells us a story that is the story ultimately of the gospel. It's the story of salvation. It's the story of how God ultimately wants us to relate to him.
Yes.
Which is in this way where we aren't striving and efforting and exhausting ourselves emotionally, physically, or spiritually to build those pyramids and try to reach the sky.
Yeah, but build our own Eden.
Right.
He's provided an
He
Eden
provided
for us,
it,
a
and
new
he
Eden.
He set them in there in this world that was already perfected. It was already made for them.
And then they get excluded from it because of sin, and they can't get back. They can't go back the way they came. And so then you have like these many long years and generations of humanity not being able to enjoy that rest. They've lost the Sabbath in a sense. You could see it that way. And so they try to make for themselves their own rest. And stories like the Tower of Babel story is an example of what it looks like when humanity tries to make their own Eden and find their own sort of Sabbath rest on their own apart from God. And what it always looks like is, at the end of the day, humans exploiting other humans.
Right.
And hierarchy and stratification of society, and what the reality then becomes, the lie is we can all enjoy our own Sabbath rest, we can all have our own piece of Eden, and we don't need God, and we don't need anything else. But the truth is that what it becomes is a small group of people at the top enjoying lots and lots of rest, and many, many people at the bottom never getting any rest at all.
And that's interesting that this would be jumping ahead, so we won't go too far into this, but I know multiple times within the command of the Sabbath, in Exodus and things like that, I believe, or Leviticus maybe, where one aspect of the Sabbath, one emphasis is that the Sabbath brings mercy, rest, and refreshment to not only man, but even the animals.
Yes, the animals get to have their Sabbath too.
Even the animals get a Sabbath. And so the Sabbath, when you lose the Sabbath, it results in sin. It results in power and subjection over the weak. It results in chaos. And again, this separation from God.
Yes. Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it, that the Sabbath shows up very, very early on in the story, and it's intimately connected to our purpose as humans, as image bearers. It connects very intimately to our position as children of God, made for relationship with Him, and then when that is broken by sin, we kind of lose track of the Sabbath for a long time. Like Sabbath doesn't show up, that I can recall, and I could be wrong on this, but I don't recall it showing up anywhere else along the rest of the stories in Genesis, not in Abraham's
I don't think it shows up
lifetime.
again until
Like, I mean, they're still counting days. Like, they still know when the seventh
Right.
day is. And again, the word in Hebrew just means it's the seventh day. And there's some things about, circumcision on the 8th and all that. So they're still counting their days, and they know how to count their days. But as far as like observing, doing something special on that day, recognizing that day
Right.
in a special way, doesn't show up again until the Exodus story, which is exactly when we also get at the same time the tabernacle, which is the new temporary mobile Eden
right.
that travels along with the camp, which is the place of where God rests, and his presence is there, and it fills the place. And it's a place where humans can once again come and approach in very, very specific ways, not just any way they want, but in very specific ways. There's a pathway to come now and approach and meet with God. And that's when suddenly the Sabbath comes back into and becomes a big deal again for people, and for these particular people.
So this is kind of just a good maybe primer on the Sabbath, and I feel like we've opened up about 50 cans of worms that like,
so many.
So much more we could dig into on so many things. But with Genesis, this idea of rest, what is it that from the beginning, from Genesis, what is it that this Sabbath is about? Again, like what is it? What does it tell us about who God is, and what and how he desires us to relate to him?
Yeah. So, if we just go, just straight to the text. So it says, so this is chapter 2, verse 2. And on the 7th day, God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the 7th day from all his work that he had done. So God blessed the 7th day and made it holy, or that what it really means is it's set apart, it's special, it's unique. It's not to be treated like the other 6 days, because on it, God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. And so that 7th day becomes, and we'll get into this when we start looking at the 10 Commandments, the 7th day then becomes a monument in a way, a monument in time. It's a testimony that this stuff didn't just get here randomly, that this world wasn't created by a chorus of competing gods, which each contributed their part, that this universe was the product of a single beautiful mind that wanted to create space ultimately for humanity to exist and to live and to thrive and to be his image bearers and to fill this place with his glory and his goodness. And so he's altered the human calendar. And it's so interesting to me that anywhere you go on the planet, it seems like, and I'm sure there has to be some exceptions somewhere, but you look at all the ancient cultures and they all ordered their calendar according to 7 days. Like, it's just so ancient and so intrinsic. It's obviously there's something in us and in our DNA that we want to see, comprehend time is ordered in this way. And he said that this 7th day is this reminder. Every week we're reminded again, we are not here by accident. We are here with a purpose. The world was made good. God is good because the world is good. He made a good world. And we have, we were made for relationship with him. And are we living into that fully or not? Every week it's another opportunity to reflect on that and say, Am I living like someone who was made for relationship with God and made to bear his image and reflect his goodness and his light into the world? Or have I just gotten sucked into all the other narratives that the world and its systems want to feed me? And so I think there's something there in that about why this day is important for us, at least from God's perspective. It's a forever reminder. It's a monument to who he is, and because he's holy, he's special. He's not like all the stories that we've invented or created over the years to explain where we came from, and he's not like any god of any other religion that you can find on the planet. He is unique. There is something totally different about him, and for me, it comes out in his amazing grace and mercy, his overpowering generosity. And when you think about, and the creation story emphasizes that because he's gone to all these great lengths, to create this world and order it and fill it, saying 7 times over during that story that this is good, this is good, this is good. And who does it end up being good for? It ends up being good for us. It ends up being a world that's perfect for us.
Right.
God doesn't need oxygen. God doesn't need, any of these other things that the earth has that make it the perfect habitat for human beings. He doesn't need any of those things, but we do. And he made it perfect for us.